Red and Blue, I'm Major Garrett in Washington. We thank you for joining us. In an exclusive interview with CBS News, former Vice President Mike Pence discussed a potential 2024 presidential bid. He also talked about his support for reforming Social Security and Medicare. Political correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns spoke with the former vice president in Hillsdale, Michigan.
In your prepared remarks today, you are expected to say, trying to urge people to resist the politics of personality. Are you referring to your former boss there?
Well, I joined the Republican Party in the days of Ronald Reagan. And I really believe that the conservative movement has always been animated by ideas. We've had big personalities, from Reagan all the way to Donald Trump. But I think it's the ideas, a commitment to a strong national defense, fiscal responsibility, limited government, and traditional values that really, I think, created this movement in many ways, and I think they still sustain it. And so I'll say to these young people here in Michigan today that they should resist the temptation of focusing on personalities or embracing a populism unmoored to conservative principle. And that the challenges that we face in this country today, whether it be Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, a menacing actions by China in the Asia Pacific, or a mountain range of debt, all require leadership that is grounded in principle and in experience. And I want to encourage these young people, many of whom I think will pursue careers in public life, to build those careers on timeless American principles.
You mentioned that you have some regrets about negative campaigns in the past. Would that include while you were campaigning with Trump?
No, I'm speaking about my early days in politics. I allowed myself my ambition to overtake what my faith and my values taught me to live out every day. I just think negative personal attacks have no place in public life, and I've embraced that principle over the past 20 years. But I must tell you, for me to have had the opportunity to run and to serve as Vice President of the United States was a great honor. Obviously, the administration did not end well, and I've written and spoken about that very plainly. But the record itself, the opportunity to have played some small role in strengthening our nation, having America standing tall in the world, reviving our economy, securing our border, and appointing 3 of the justices that gave America a new beginning on the right to life has been a great privilege of my life.
You see that as an achievement?
All of what we did during the Trump-Pence administration, I think, left America and our liberties stronger and more secure. And over the last 2 years, seeing the way American credibility has eroded on the world stage in the wake of the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, seeing the runaway spending in Washington, D.C. that's launched the worst inflation in 40 years and what appears to be a steady assault on values and liberties. Like most Americans, I long for the policies of the Trump-Pence administration, and whatever the future holds for me and my family, we'll continue to fight for those values.
I do want to ask about entitlement reform, because you have been out there advocating for some reforms to Medicare and Social Security. You have Republican leaders on Capitol Hill saying they don't want to touch it. Are they wrong?
Caitlin, we have a national debt the size of our nation's economy today, and that's unsustainable. And for President Joe Biden, his policy is insolvency. And if we don't address the issue of entitlement reform and Social Security and Medicare in a compassionate, common sense, responsible way that doesn't impact anybody at the point of the need, doesn't even have to impact Americans that are going to retire in the next 20 years, but sets it on a more sustainable fiscal foundation, we're going to pile on those 3 granddaughters of mine and the next generation of Americans a mountain range of debt that, if we wait 25 years to deal with it, the American people will only be faced with bad choices. So, I want to stipulate that the decision by Speaker McCarthy to keep Social Security and Medicare out of the debate over the debt ceiling negotiations, I think is the right decision. It's too large of an issue to deal with in that single issue. But we need to produce national leadership that can be straight with the American people, explain the magnitude of the debt crisis that we are facing in this country, and offer the kind of common sense, responsible reforms that I think would be broadly acceptable to the American people today. If we fail to do that, I think we'll fail those granddaughters of mine. I think we'll fail future generations, and we'll set America on a path for a debt crisis the likes of which the world has never seen.
So is it fair to say that if you do run for president, entitlement reform will be a key part of your platform?
Well, if my wife and I are continuing to give prayerful consideration to entering the race for the Republican nomination for president. But I can assure you that if we choose to run, we'll bring that broad conservative agenda that's characterized my life and my career to the fore. That means a strong national defense. It means standing up for America's place as leader of the free world, confronting aggression, whether it's in Eastern Europe or standing strong in the Asia Pacific. But yes, it also means promoting policies that will get the economy growing again, but also advancing policies that will set our national budget on a sustainable pathway. I must say, the American people have a demonstrated ability to do hard things, but it's only been at those times in our history when we've had leaders that were willing to be straight with the American people, tell them what the real challenges are, what the solutions are. And if I'm called into that contest, I'll speak just that way.
So on entitlements, do you think that Republicans should take this head on?
Well, I think it requires presidential leadership. And Joe Biden's policy is insolvency. I mean, literally to ignore a looming debt crisis for this country that is driven by Social Security and Medicare, I think is unconscionable. But so long as the president is failing to lead on that issue, I think Republicans should make it clear that while it's not in the debt ceiling negotiations, that they're open to responsible and compassionate reforms of entitlements down the road. But I really do believe it's ultimately going to take presidential leadership to set our nation back on a path of fiscal solvency.
Going back to what you mentioned a little while ago, that you and your family are considering a potential presidential run. You have said by the spring you'll make a decision. What is left to consider here?
Well, Ronald Reagan said memorably that the American people have a funny way of letting you know if they want you to run for president. And over the last 2 years, I've traveled to some 35 states, and we're going to continue to travel, continue to listen. And my wife and I will be making a decision, I'm sure by the spring, about what our intentions are. And
as you consider kind of where you fit into this potential field, where does Mike Pence fit in? What is the constituency? I mean, you have to acknowledge that there is a strong base of support for the former president. As you know from what you saw on January 6th, there are, a significant portion of the base that is upset with how you handled that day. Is there any ability to move those voters?
Well, I just have great confidence in the American people. I don't think anyone could have defeated Hillary Clinton in 2016 other than Donald Trump. And I didn't realize that initially. I supported another candidate in the Indiana primary. Mm-hmm. But Donald Trump offered a change of leadership and the kind of campaign that was able to take on a Clinton campaign machine that was decades in the making. And I think Republican voters chose wisely. And I'm just very confident that Republican voters will choose wisely again. I think they'll look at the challenges facing our nation, and they'll look at the men and women that have stepped forward to vie for that nomination. And I'm confident our standard bearer will carry the day in the fall of 2024.
If that standard bearer is the former president, if he is the nominee, would you support him?
Well, I think we'll have better choices, and I really trust Republican voters to sort it out.
Caitlin Huey-Burns joins us now to talk about that conversation. The former vice president told you he thinks the party will have better choices, yet he's still not willing to say he should be one of them. What do you think that reticence is all about?
Yeah, Major, it's an interesting dynamic where he is essentially saying that he, won't commit to supporting former President Trump if he is the nominee. After that question that you just saw, I pressed him again. So that's not a yes. And he said,
No.
again, I think we'll have better choices. So take what you will from there. But I saw that as kind of some news there in terms of not willing to commit to supporting the former president, and consider that the RNC is wanting those running for president to sign a unity pledge that they will support the eventual nominee. For Mike Pence, he has repeatedly said that he is talking to his family, that he is traveling around the country listening. I asked if, during those travels that has incentivized him more to run, and he said he's been very encouraged by what he's been seeing. But what's really interesting, Major, is he kind of identifies a lane within the Republican Party that is, to me, a party that existed before Donald Trump. I mean, he's talking about entitlement reform. He's talking about a hawkish foreign policy. He's talking about kind of a toned down temperature. That kind of describes the pre-Trump Republican Party. So that is kind of where he feels like he can carve out a lane. The big question is answering for those intervening years. And I think that is going to be the challenge, right? That, you did have Republicans who are upset with how he handled January 6th, who are loyal to the former president. And meanwhile, you have other, fresh faces, Nikki Haley already in the race, potentially Ron DeSantis, who is on a book tour this week.
Right. And when the former vice president is ambivalent about that idea of endorsing the eventual Republican nominee, should it be Trump, perhaps he knows better than anyone the value of what kind of pledge that would be should former President Trump make it, meaning would he actually be willing to endorse a Republican nominee not named Donald Trump? I get from the former vice president's answer, he's already figured out the answer to that question. Caitlin, you worked very hard to try to get some specifics out of the former vice president on entitlements. Now, this is not the best TV topic in the world, but Medicare and Social Security and their solvency do matter. Did the vice president give you any idea about what he means when he says responsible and compassionate reforms to either of those entitlements?
Right. And this is the big thing here, right? Because, OK, you can advocate for reform, but how do you do it? And he hasn't laid out a specific plan yet. I'd imagine that that would be to come during a presidential campaign. But he did make clear that he doesn't want this to be, any reforms to affect those who are currently receiving benefits. At least that's what he was implying in our conversation. But, this is a contrast to Republicans on Capitol Hill. You have Mitch McConnell, getting really into a battle with Senator Rick Scott, who had advocated at one point for, sunsetting Medicare and Social Security after 5 years and reevaluating the budget there. He really went after him there. You have Kevin McCarthy acknowledging that this is not part of the conversation for the debt ceiling, and Pence acknowledged that too. But here's kind of this hearkening back to a traditional kind of Republican platform that Republicans used to argue a la Paul Ryan for entitlement reforms, and that really changed during the Trump administration. So it is significant that he's leaning in on this issue, especially because at the State of the Union, Joe Biden, essentially tried to get Republicans to commit to not touching those programs. So that will be an interesting kind of point to watch in a Republican primary.
Caitlin Huey-Burns with a key interview. We thank you.